the Democratic Party this year. I want to read now what the president says himself. In a post on X, formerly known as Twitter, he says he reiterates he's decided not to accept the nomination and to focus his energies on his duties as president for the remainder of his term. He goes on to say that his first decision as the party nominee in 2020 was to pick Kamala Harris as my vice president. He says, and it's been the best decision I've made. Today, he says, I want to offer my full support and endorsement for Kamala to be the nominee of our party this year. He concludes by saying, and again, this is President Biden saying, Democrats, it's time to come together and beat Trump. Let's do this. So, Kristen, we now have our moderator of Meet the Press joining us on the phone. We now have a real answer now to the question that we've had ever since this news broke that President Biden is withdrawing from this race. He is endorsing Kamala Harris to take the top of the ticket. What does the process look like from here? She obviously now would have to suggest or select, I should say, a running mate, Kristen, which is another process that will have to unfold over the course of the next couple of weeks before the Democratic convention.
That's right. And it's our understanding that the vice president had actually started that process, Hallie. And this is not a surprise. Again, this moment is stunning when you take a step back and really think about what is unfolding. And yet, this is where we believed this was heading if and when President Biden did make that ultimate decision to drop out of the race. There was so much pressure on him from within the party to choose Kamala Harris, to endorse Kamala Harris as his vice president, because think about the backlash had he not done this. I think there's also an urgency to have an answer to the question, who will replace him at the top of the ticket, and just a deep concern that if there were to be a so-called mini primary, that would ultimately expend a lot of time, a lot of resources that the party just does not think it has at this point. So again, Hallie, not overwhelmingly surprising that he is endorsing Vice President Kamala Harris. And again, she has started the process of looking for a potential running mate, undoubtedly looking at a number of governors all across this country. But again, just a really stunning moment that the President of the United States has now officially announced he's not seeking re-election and is passing the torch, as those protesters yesterday outside of the White House had urged him to do, to pass the torch. He has now done that, Hallie.
One of the questions, of course, Kristen, is does this put Democrats in a better position against former President Trump, in a relatively equal position as if it were President Biden on the ticket? When you look at some of the polling, there are some surveys, some numbers that suggest that the vice president polls slightly better than President Biden did against former President Trump. But there's some polling that suggests it's fairly even here. So there's a real question mark, of course, moving forward as to what this means politically for Democrats come November, Kristen.
There is a big question mark, but I think you hit the nail on the head. Look, she's competitive with him. And that's what I think President Biden wanted to see before he made that official decision to pass the torch, as it were, to his vice president. He wanted to see that she's competitive, and the polls suggest she is very competitive. And look, I've been talking to Democrats who say this is a moment in which she can be reintroduced to the country, not just on the campaign trail, but also when you think about it, the convention. Hallie, think about the convention that you and I just covered in Milwaukee. All of that attention will now be foisted upon the vice president as she prepares to take the mantle of the Democratic nomination. So I think that that is an opportunity, and the Democratic Party believes that is a potential strength and could help them in the polls and with some of those undecided, moderate, independent voters who are going to be so critical in November. And by the way, the Trump campaign has already set its sights on the vice president. They've already started doing their own opposition research to lay out the case against her, Hallie.
Kristen Welker, thank you so much. I'm going to ask you to stay close to your phone for just a second, and I want to remind people what has happened now over the course of the last extraordinary 30 minutes here, with weeks now of pressure growing publicly on President Biden to withdraw from the Democratic ticket, to withdraw from the 2024 race. He is announcing this afternoon that he will, in fact, do so. In a letter that is just out from the president, he begins by talking about the great progress as a nation that he believes the country has made over the last 3.5 years, ticking through accomplishments as he sees it on the economy, on gun safety, on the judiciary, on climate legislation. But then he says it has been the greatest honor of my life to serve as your president. While it has been my intention to seek re-election, President Biden says, He goes on to write, I believe it is in the best interest of my party and the country for me to stand down and to focus solely on fulfilling my duties as president for the remainder of my term. We do expect to hear from President Biden at some point later this week, publicly on camera, about this significant decision. I want to get to Kelly O'Donnell, who's live for us on the White House North Lawn. And Kelly, remember, President Biden just came down with COVID not too long ago. He has been recovering at his home in Rehoboth Beach, Delaware. Perhaps, Kelly, with family members, with the First Lady, people who have enormous influence on his thinking and on his thought process, as we have reported here at NBC News. Talk us through that aspect of it.
Well, based on all of our reporting and our observations over time with covering the president, what we certainly know is that he has a close circle of advisors, some of whom have been with him in Rehoboth Beach during this time of convalescence with COVID, something many Americans have had multiple times and understand what that is like, and family around him, key family members. Among his closest advisors has always been the First Lady, Dr. Jill Biden, his sister, Valerie Biden Owens, and key family members like his son, Hunter Biden. We don't know exactly the timeline of how all of this came together, but we know that clearly the president had wanted to continue. He also was hearing the voices from within his own party. To be the president running for re-election, you are, in fact, the standard bearer of that party. And the bow had been breaking for days, crack by crack, now with roughly 40 elected members of Congress in the Democratic Party urging him to step aside, and looking at the polling, looking at all of the conditions, and trying to take a measure of where do things go next. Also, after the Republican convention has concluded, we've now seen former President Trump and his new running mate, Senator J.D. Vance, out on the campaign trail. It gives a stark picture of one party that was in disagreement internally, divided internally, with what should come next. Should the president continue? If he didn't continue, who would step in? And now we know he's endorsing the vice president. That has been critical for Democratic officials who remind all of us as we're covering this that the base of the voter in the voter constituency in the Democratic Party is certainly black women, and to bypass the vice president would have been untenable for many of them. Progressives had been standing by the president, the Congressional Black Caucus, the Congressional Hispanic Caucus. Those core constituencies were with him until he made this decision. And so it is notable that the vice president's team would now be thinking about potential running mates for her. I have been told that that process is now opening up, and there would be kind of a deep bench of Democrats who might serve in that role. One piece at a time. This decision today, announced publicly through his social media, obviously means there is a chance for the president to continue to recover from COVID, and when he addresses the nation, he will want to do that in full voice, feeling better, no longer positive for the virus, all of those kinds of things. We're all in this moment, and it is really extraordinary to have the president not seek re-election after he fought so hard to maintain his position at the top of the ticket, and many next steps that we will be exploring in the days to come before the Democratic convention. One source I talked to said if they were divided going into the convention, it would be a certain doom for the party. This allows some time to begin next steps and to try to get back on the issues that they believe are issues that can support a victory, even though there is turmoil on the ticket itself. So that's where we start off, Hallie, and I'll toss it back to you.
Kelly, thank you. Don't go too far, please. I want to report now from our colleague Mike Memoli that a source familiar with the conversation tells us that President Biden did, in fact, speak with Vice President Kamala Harris today ahead of the announcement. I want to go to Yamiche Alcindor, who's been the tip of the spear in reporting on preparations that the vice president's team had been taking behind the scenes. In a way, Yamiche, that left open the possibility that President Biden may not take the move that he ultimately did today. Talk us through it.
That's right. Well, of course, this is huge news, but this is news that the vice president was preparing for. Now, of course, as your vice president, she is someone who had always been ready to take the job as president. But in the last few weeks, sources had told me that she was doing a really sort of distinct balancing act. She was both publicly and privately supporting President Biden while also quietly getting ready herself if she had to be the top of the ticket, which, of course, now with the president endorsing her, of course, her team is going to be hoping that she becomes the top of the ticket. So I've been talking to allies of the vice president who were laying out a path to victory possibly for her, because of course she's going to now be taking this step where she has to make up, they say, for lost ground here. So looking at what that might look like, they were talking already about making staff changes to the Biden campaign, possibly at the very, very top. They were also talking about sort of what a path to victory could look like for her, for President Biden. He was looking at Minnesota, at Wisconsin, Michigan. She might still be interested in those states, but sources close to her have told me that she's really interested also in looking at the South, African Americans in particular being a key part of the Democratic pace, and will be a key part of her because she's going to be, if she is selected at the top of the ticket, of course, this history-making candidate, being the first Black woman and the first South Asian American woman to be a major party tickets nominee. So I was told that Georgia and North Carolina were the places that she was going to be looking very closely at. So really what you see here is the vice president in some ways having to step into this role that people close to her had been really preparing for behind the scenes.
Yamiche Alcindor, thank you so much.
I also want to
again, go ahead, Yamiche, very quickly.
I also want to just point out that there were a lot of people that are really sort of talking about this open process and what that might look like. And from my understanding is that there are going to be a lot of women, especially Black women who are leaders of the Democratic Party, who are going to be saying she cannot be stepped over, that she cannot be put aside, that as the vice president, but also as an African-American woman who has been in and out of the White House and who, of course, speaks directly to the base of the Democratic Party, with Black women being the most loyal voters for Democrats. Yeah. From my understanding, they're going to really be pushing hard. So expect in the next few minutes, next few seconds, to hear a lot of Black women in the Democratic Party talking about the fact that she has to be the nominee. Ali.
Yamiche Alcindor, thank you very much. Again, significant news breaking today. President Biden withdrawing from the 2024 race, stepping off of the ticket, and endorsing his vice president, Kamala Harris, the start of a new moment in this presidential race. That does it for our NBC News special report. We'll see it tonight on Nightly and on NBC News Now.